In the Champions League quarter-finals of 2005, Liverpool held up cards that said amicizia, or friendship in Italian. In return, Juve Ultras hit them back with this: easy to speak, difficult to forgive. Murders. 15th April 1989, Sheffield. God exists. To understand what had happened, we must go back 30 years and find out how did this all began. In the UEFA Cup of 1974, prior to Liverpool's match against Red Star, it was largely anticipated that Liverpool would win. After all, they were the reigning champions and the opposition had been underwhelming. Yet, by the end of the tie, Liverpool lost both the legs. Manager Bill Shankly and the boot room boys had come to this realization that physicality with which they prided themselves with was now obsolete. Shankly himself admitted, "The top Europeans showed us how to break out of defense effectively. The pace of their movement was dictated by their first pass. We had to learn how to be patient like that and think about next 2 or 3 moves when we had the ball." By the end of the season, Shankly had resigned and the mantle was passed on to his assistant, Bob Paisley, a more tactically astute head in Liverpool's camp. Paisley knew things needed to change. "Our approach was a bit frantic," he said. "We treated every match like a war. The strength of British football lay in our challenge for the ball, but the Continentals took that away from us by learning how to intercept." It was a lesson in defeat that launched Liverpool to soaring heights. Heights that even Shankly couldn't reach. Soon enough, they were European champions. Between 1977 and 1984, they had won it 4 times. Not only Liverpool, teams like Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa joined them as champions themselves. For the first time in history, English football sat atop of football's food chain. Liverpool most certainly the leader of the flock. In a way, it was Star that had guided the bird. But the things, however, weren't so simple. While they enjoyed success on the pitch, off it, situation was rather dire. England at that time was going through a period referred as the English disease. With England struggling economically, and the worst of all, the hooliganism was a serious problem. Raucous, notorious, and highly violent English fans had earned the reputation of sick men of Europe. With incidents of brawls, vandalism, and thievery all across Europe, the English travelling party was a disgrace. Hooligan gangs had names like Chelsea Headhunters and West Ham's Intercity Firm, while some factions of Liverpool fans were called Scouse Vikings, who looted designer sportswear from across the Europe. For England and its hooligans, the worst was yet to come.
The gang would lay in wait for supporters as they left by bus, coach or on foot. Some of the victims were left with visiting cards. One recovered by the police read, "You have been nominated and dealt with by the Chelsea Headhunters."
In 1984, when Liverpool squared off against Juventus in the finals of European Cup, there was an anticipatory anxiety in the very old Hazel Stadium. As the proceedings unfolded, a benign section of Juve supporters was charged at by hooligans. And given the dire state of stadiums, a wall collapsed, and 39 Juve supporters lost their lives. Nearly 600 were injured, and even then, the game wasn't abandoned. Platini scored a penalty, and that was enough for a win, although the victory was hardly any consolation for Juventus or their supporters. English teams were banned from the European competition for 6 years. It was a national embarrassment. Sunday Times described it as slum game played by slum people in slum stadiums. Founders of football were on the verge of forsaking it. Attendances in the stadium was at an all-time low. They were considered unsafe in more ways than one. The evils that English football was dealing with was multifaceted. First was the obvious case of hooliganism, which had been prevalent since 60s. The other was its archaic stadiums, which were hideously uncomfortable, with its greasy steps and packed terraces, which were full of chaos and fights. If Hazel was a public mortification, then Hillsborough was certainly a personal lamentation, the darkest stain in history of English football. In the FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest, around 96 fatalities were reported, and over 700 people were injured in the human crush that ensued, most of them Liverpool supporters. That would be the last of it. The then PM Thatcher had had enough. An in-depth inquiry over the matter was commissioned, known as the Taylor Report. It concluded that the disaster was caused due to police's inability to limit fans from congesting the stands. It also criticized the appalling condition of stadiums, and remarked that all major stadiums should be converted to all-seater. Over the next few years, British Parliament passed the Football Spectators Act to take strict action against hooligan behaviours, with punishment on misconducts in stadiums or overseas. For English football, things were never going to be the same again. It seemed like English football's problems were never ending. Things would fall into disarray at every turn. It was this systematic malfunctioning which sparked a bunch of young club owners to take matters into their own hand and salvage this fast-turning wasteland of a sport. Arsenal Vice Chairman David Dean, Manchester United Chairman Martin Edwards, and Tottenham Hotspur's owner Irving Scholar, with a few others, had formed an unlikely band called as the Big Five. They had shared their frustrations on how Football League was an orthodox institution, unwilling to change and lacked commercial know-how of the game. It was a bit of a club within a club, Scholar said. What we all had in common was that we loved football, and we wanted football to do well. We knew that if football did well, everything else would flow from that. Prior to the 80s, football in England was televised exclusively through highlight program, based on a dreaded revenue sharing model where all the 92 teams split the money equally. By 80s, Liverpool and others' on-field successes made broadcasters realize that there's more money to be made in live games than in shoddy little highlight reels. In 1982, Football League had only managed to secure a lowly deal of $5.2 million, which they had failed to renew, causing a virtual blackout in 1985. While in America, the NFL had landed a staggering $2 billion in TV broadcasting deal. It sent shockwaves across Europe, a record sports deal anywhere in the world at that time. Dean and co were blown away by the numbers. If a sport that is largely played within a country could generate that sort of money, this was a game watched and played by the whole world. It was clear to them, if they were ever going to make any money from owning a club, it was going to come from television.
League Division 1. Arsenal 2, Tottenham Hotspur 0. Birmingham City 3, Aston Villa 0. Brighton and Hove Albion 0. Southampton 1. Ipswich Town 2. Norwich City 3. Liverpool 5, Manchester City 2.
As businessmen, Dean and Scholar had already been introduced to NFL and were very impressed by it. That was an eye-opener, Dean said. I understood that was how a sport should be run. The way they marketed it, it was more than 90 minutes of football. It was an event. This was a family sport. American football became the shining example of what they wanted to achieve. Scholar said, in terms of commercial attraction, it was amazing. You could see the future. The future they were imagining was still just a dream. They no longer wanted to work in the confines of Football League, and the blackout was the tipping point. The trio of Dean, Scholar and Edwards had taken upon themselves to find out someone who could broadcast their matches. And this is where Greg Dyke from ITV comes in. Him being an uncompromising businessman, almost instantly struck a chord with the Big Five. His proposal was simple. He would offer Big Five clubs, Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United, Everton and Tottenham, a minimum of $1 million for the rights to their home matches. And the remaining 87 clubs could figure out a deal of their own. When the Football League found out that Dyke had colluded with the Big Five to hand them a far better deal, they were furious. In retaliation, they rushed to cut a deal of their own to prevent the divide. Dean was made to step down as the member of management committee. An ugly settlement, but it had to be done. Things, however, got a whole lot uglier after that. Soon the Hillsborough happened. A nightmare for the rest of the nation, but for Dean and the others, it was an opportunity. In the aftermath of the disaster, Taylor Report had strengthened their breakaway sentiments. The Big Five, joined by few others, didn't want it to be seen with the league and their incompetent way of running football. They had been striving for a better part of the decade, and now they wanted a league of their own.
Momentous occasion this for Arsenal, coming here requiring a 2-goal lead and snatched it in the most dramatic fashion in the last minute of the game.
In practice, it wasn't so simple. Few years ago, Football League had passed a legislation which required clubs to notify 3 years before quitting the league. It was a watertight bylaw designed to thwart breakaway like these. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected ally, the FA. The Football Association was national governing body of football, unconcerned by the day-to-day working of the game. They were all too happy to back the Big Five when they saw they could wrestle control out of the hands of nosy Football League. Rick Perry, newly appointed as the chief executive of the so-called Premier League, had soon found out a stipulation in the FA rulebook, stating that no league could demand its member club to give a withdrawal notice before 31st of December of the current playing season, meaning the Football League's 3-year rule was in direct contravention of the FA rules. And upon this contravention, the Premier League was formed. With most things out of the way, the Premier League was still to decide on a broadcaster. Dykes ITV were almost certain to get the deal, offering £84 million over 4 years. However, in more turn of events, Alan Sugar, who had recently taken over Tottenham from Scholar, happened to be a satellite manufacturer. Seeing his obvious gains in the deal, he demanded his business partner, Rupert Murdoch at Sky, to blow them out of the water. Sky offered around £300 million for 5 years. And as Sky had promised, it was a whole new ballgame. Club owners were newly cash rich and couldn't shy away from spending. A little known player, Jean-Marc Bosman, unintentionally opened the floodgates to the modern day transfer, all because he was unhappy how clubs controlled the player movement. His legal battle brought about a series of changes and broke the status quo. Before the ruling, clubs were limited in the number of foreign players they could sign. In European competitions, UEFA rules stated that clubs could field 3+2 foreign players, of which 2 must come from the youth setup. Post-Bosman, clubs could sign any number of players from European Union countries and field them without a single player from that country. From that point on, there was no turning back. Premier League by the start of 2000s was contending for the best league in the world with Serie A, but couldn't quite shake them off. They would require a divine intervention, a Deus Ex Machina of their own. Deus Ex Machina is a plot device whereby a seemingly unsolvable problem in a story is suddenly and abruptly resolved by an unexpected and unlikely occurrence. Its function can be to resolve an otherwise unresolvable plot situation, to surprise the audience. In this case, it was money, and it was brought in by men who tried to play God.